Jambira was a young woman full of hope and excitement as she stepped into her new home in the grand village of Tumbaza. She had just married Olan, the son of a wealthy merchant, and she wanted nothing more than to be a good wife and a respectful daughter-in-law. She had been raised in a humble household where kindness and hard work were valued above all else, and she carried those lessons with her into her new life. However, from the moment she arrived, she sensed that something was wrong. Her mother-in-law, Ekwu, barely smiled at her, and her husband's sister, Sessi, looked at her with cold, judging eyes. Jambira tried to ignore it, hoping that with time they would grow to love her. She made every effort to help around the house, always speaking softly and showing them respect. But no matter what she did, Ekwu and Sessi seemed determined to dislike her. Ekwu had always dreamed that her son, Olan, would marry a woman from a wealthy and powerful family, someone with status, influence, and connections that would elevate their name. But instead, he had chosen Jambira, a woman from a humble background, with no riches or important relatives. To Ekwu, this was unacceptable. She saw Jambira as an outsider, someone who did not belong in their grand home. No matter how kind or hard-working Jambira was, Ekwu refused to accept her as part of the family. Sessi, on the other hand, had a different reason for hating Jambira. As Olan's only sister, she had always been the most important woman in his life. She controlled many things in their household and was used to having her brother's attention. But now, with Jambira in the picture, she felt threatened. She feared that Olan would start listening to his wife instead of her. The thought of losing her influence made Sessi resent Jambira even more. Together, Ekwu and Sessi decided to make Jambira's life miserable. They treated her like a servant, forcing her to do all the household chores while they sat around, enjoying the comforts of their wealth. While they relaxed, Jambira scrubbed the floors, cooked meals, and fetched water from the well. If she ever slowed down or showed signs of exhaustion, they scolded her harshly. They took pleasure in seeing her struggle, believing it would remind her of her place. No matter how much she tried to please them, they only made things harder for her. As the days passed, Ekwu and Sessi's hatred for Jambira grew stronger. It was not enough for them to overwork her. They wanted to break her spirit completely. They decided that the best way to do this was to starve her. If she was weak and hungry, she would have no strength to fight back or complain. Every day, Ekwu and Sessi sat at the grand dining table, feasting on the finest meals: soft, warm bread, tender meat cooked in rich spices, and fresh fruit straight from the market. But when it was time for Jambira to eat, they pushed aside the scraps and leftovers, barely enough to fill her stomach. Some days, they didn't give her anything at all, forcing her to go to bed with hunger gnawing at her body. Jambira could feel herself growing weaker with each passing day, but she refused to show her pain. She held on to the hope that Olan, her husband, would notice what was happening and stand up for her. But Olan, blinded by his mother's influence and his sister's constant whispers, ignored her suffering. Whenever Jambira tried to speak to him, he brushed her off, saying that his mother and sister knew what was best. His love for her slowly faded, and instead of protecting her, he became distant, allowing Ekwu and Sessi to continue their cruelty without question. Jambira's body grew weaker with each passing day, but she refused to complain. She still believed that Olan would open his eyes and see the pain she was going through. She hoped that one day he would notice how tired she looked, how her hands trembled from exhaustion, or how she barely had the strength to lift the heavy pots in the kitchen. But no matter how much she suffered in silence, Olan never paid attention. He remained blind to her misery, listening only to his mother and sister. The villagers of Tumbaza began to notice the changes in Jambira. When she had first arrived, she was full of life. Her skin glowed and her eyes sparkled with happiness. But now, she was a shadow of the woman she used to be. Her cheeks had hollowed, her once bright eyes were dull, and her beautiful clothes hung loosely on her thin frame. Some villagers whispered about her mistreatment, pitying the poor young woman, but no one dared to challenge Ekwu. She was a powerful woman in the village, feared and respected, and no one wanted to get on her bad side. Despite everything, Jambira held on to hope. She told herself that if she could just endure a little longer, things would change. But deep inside, a painful truth was beginning to form. No one was going to save her. She was completely alone. One evening, as Jambira struggled to finish her chores with what little strength she had left, Olan called her into the main hall. His face was cold, and his eyes held no warmth. She felt a sinking feeling in her chest as she stood before him, hoping for even a small sign of kindness. But instead, his words struck her like a blade. "You are nothing but a burden, Jambira," he said without emotion. "You bring no wealth, no honor to this family. My mother was right. You do not belong here." Jambira's heart pounded in disbelief. She had endured every hardship, every cruelty, hoping that Olan would one day stand up for her. But now, he was the one casting her out. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face, and begged him to reconsider. "Olan, please," she whispered. "I have done nothing but love and serve this family. Where will I go?" But Olan had already made up his mind. At a signal from Ekwu, two servants grabbed Jambira by the arms and dragged her toward the door. She fought to break free, turning to Olan one last time, but he looked away. Without another word, the doors slammed shut behind her. Jambira stood outside in the cold night air, wearing only the simple dress she had on. She had no food, no money, and nowhere to go. The grand house she once called home now stood behind her like a cruel reminder of her pain. With tears blurring her vision, she turned and walked away, her feet carrying her toward the unknown. As she wandered into the forest, the weight of betrayal crushed her spirit. The man she had loved, the home she had worked so hard to keep, had thrown her away as if she were nothing. The darkness of the trees swallowed her as she stumbled forward, her heart broken beyond repair. Jambira walked for hours, her body weak from hunger and exhaustion. She didn't know where she was going, but she kept moving, her bare feet dragging against the rough ground. The pain in her heart was even greater than the pain in her body. She had lost everything, her home, her husband, and the life she had dreamed of. The world felt cruel and unforgiving. As she reached the edge of a river, her legs gave out beneath her. She fell to the ground, too weak to stand, her vision blurred, and the sound of rushing water became distant. With one last breath, she closed her eyes and surrendered to the darkness. Hours later, a figure appeared from the shadows. Elder Mwenzi, a wise and powerful herbalist, was making his way through the forest when he spotted Jambira's lifeless form near the riverbank. His sharp eyes studied her fragile body, and without hesitation, he knelt beside her. He could sense that she had suffered greatly, but he also saw something else: strength hidden beneath her pain. Gently, he lifted her into his arms and carried her deep into the forest, to a place few people had ever seen. It was the Hidden Valley, a secret and peaceful land where only those in need found refuge. There, Mwenzi and his healers worked to bring Jambira back to life. They fed her warm broth, bathed her wounds, and wrapped her in soft cloths. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, and her body regained its strength. Days passed before Jambira finally opened her eyes. She found herself in a quiet hut, the scent of herbs filling the air. She didn't know where she was, but for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. As she tried to sit up, an old man with wise eyes entered the room. "You are strong," he said with a knowing smile, "and your journey is far from over." Jambira stayed in the Hidden Valley under Elder Mwenzi's care. Each day she grew stronger, her body slowly recovering from the suffering she had endured. At first, she was quiet, still carrying the pain of her past, but Mwenzi saw something in her, a strength that had not yet been fully awakened. One morning, as they sat by the river, Mwenzi spoke to her in his calm, knowing voice. "You have been through great pain, but pain is not the end of your story. You have the spirit of a leader, Jambira. You were never meant to be small." His words stirred something deep inside her. For so long, she had been treated as if she were worthless. But here, in the Hidden Valley, she was beginning to feel something different, powerful. Mwenzi began to teach her, sharing knowledge that only a few were privileged to learn. He taught her the secrets of herbs, how to heal sickness, and how to use nature's gifts to help others. Jambira also learned about trade and business, understanding how wealth was built and sustained. She listened carefully, absorbing every lesson, realizing that knowledge was the key to changing her life. As the weeks passed, she transformed. No longer was she the weak, broken woman who had been thrown out like a piece of old cloth. She stood tall, her heart filled with a new purpose. The past no longer defined her, it had only prepared her for what was coming. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with golden light, Jambira made a decision. She would not live in the shadows of her pain, she would rise above it. It was time to rebuild her life, and this time, no one would ever take it away from her again. With Elder Mwenzi's guidance, Jambira felt ready to begin a new chapter in her life. After months of learning in the Hidden Valley, she knew she had the skills and the strength to make something of herself. Mwenzi told her that the world outside was full of opportunities, but only those who had the courage to seize them would succeed. Jambira left the Hidden Valley and traveled to the city of Makala, a bustling place full of life, color, and energy. It was a city full of traders and merchants, where fortunes were made and lost every day. She felt a mix of excitement and fear as she entered the busy streets, but she knew this was where her future lay. Using the knowledge she had gained, Jambira began her own trading business. She started small, buying herbs and fabrics from local markets and selling them to those in need. She was patient, working hard every day, learning the rhythms of the city, and making careful choices. As time passed, her reputation grew. People began to trust her because of the quality of the goods she sold and her honesty. As her business expanded, so did her wealth. She learned the art of negotiating, making smart investments, and building strong relationships with other traders. Before long, Jambira was one of the wealthiest women in the region. She owned shops, land, and had a growing network of loyal customers. It wasn't just her business that flourished. Her confidence grew too. She no longer felt like the woman who had once been mistreated and abandoned. She was now a powerful, respected businesswoman, and she knew that she had earned every bit of her success. In just a few years, Jambira's name became known far and wide, not just for her wealth, but for her wisdom and leadership. People who had once looked down on her now admired her, and all the while, she continued to remember her humble beginnings and the lessons she had learned in the hidden valley. This new life was only the beginning, and Jambira was ready for whatever came next. As Jambira's business grew, her success spread far beyond the city of Makala. People spoke of her achievements in hushed tones and amazed whispers, and soon the news reached Tumbaza, the village where she'd once been mistreated and thrown away. The villagers couldn't believe their ears when they heard that the poor, weak woman they had known had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the region. Meanwhile, back in Tumbaza, things were not going well for Ekwu and Sesi. Their once luxurious lifestyle had come crashing down. The fortune they had once enjoyed had slipped through their fingers because of poor decisions and careless mismanagement. Ekwu's pride and arrogance, combined with Sesi's selfishness, had led them into debt, and soon they found themselves struggling to make ends meet. The riches they had once taken for granted were now a distant memory. Olan's business, which had once been thriving with the help of his family's wealth, also began to collapse. Without Jambira's steady support and guidance, he was left to manage everything on his own, but he lacked the skills and experience. Slowly, the business failed, and soon Olan found himself just as poor as the family he had turned his back on. Ekwu and Sesi, who had once treated Jambira so cruelly, were now living in poverty, struggling to survive. The tables had turned completely. Where they once looked down on Jambira, they now found themselves in a situation where they had to ask for help. It seemed impossible to believe, but it was the truth. The woman they had once thrown out had risen higher than they could have ever imagined. Desperate and with no other option left, Ekwu and Sesi decided to take a bold step. They heard whispers in the market about a powerful merchant woman in Makala, who had risen from nothing to become one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the land. With no money and no way to survive, they realized that their only chance to escape their poverty was to seek help from this woman, hoping that her kindness and generosity would save them. Determined to find this mysterious woman, they set off for Makala, traveling for days with little more than hope to guide them. When they finally arrived, they were stunned by the grandeur of the city. The buildings were taller than anything they had ever seen, and the streets were lined with luxury. It didn't take long before they learned where the powerful merchant woman lived, in a beautiful, palace-like home that stood out among the others. With their heads low in shame, Ekwu and Sesi made their way to the gates of the grand house. They had never imagined they would find themselves in such a position, but now they had no choice. They knelt before the large doors, their hearts heavy with regret, and begged for help. They spoke of their hardships, their ruin, and their desperation, asking for just a little assistance to get back on their feet. But what they didn't know was that the woman they were pleading with was none other than Jambira, the very woman they had mistreated and cast out all those years ago. They had no idea that the powerful merchant they sought was the same woman they had once looked down on and treated with cruelty. As they knelt before the doors, unaware of the truth, they waited, hoping for mercy. But little did they know, their past actions would soon come back to haunt them in ways they could never have imagined. As the doors of the grand house slowly creaked open, Ekwu and Sesi were unaware of the woman who was about to step into their lives once again. They expected to see a stranger, someone who might offer them some charity out of kindness. Instead, the person who appeared before them took their breath away. Jambira stepped forward, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtyard. She was no longer the weak, starving woman they had once cast aside. Now she stood tall and strong, dressed in luxurious silks that shimmered in the sunlight, adorned with sparkling gold jewelry. Her face, once gaunt and tired, now glowed with health and confidence. She looked nothing like the fragile woman they had abandoned in the forest all those years ago. The realization hit them like a bolt of lightning. Ceci gasped in shock, her eyes widening as tears filled her eyes. She couldn't hold them back any longer. The woman they had treated so cruelly was now far beyond anything they could have imagined. In that moment, the weight of their actions came crashing down on her, and she sobbed uncontrollably. She saw the truth. They had been blind to Jambira's strength and potential, and now the woman they had mistreated was standing before them, more powerful and successful than they could have ever hoped to be. Ekwu, on the other hand, tried to hold onto her pride. Despite the fear creeping into her heart, she refused to beg. She had always thought of herself as superior, but now, in front of Jambira's greatness, her confidence wavered. Her prideful exterior trembled as she realized the power had shifted, and the woman they had wronged was now in control. She looked at Jambira, but her voice caught in her throat, unable to say the words she knew they needed to speak. Jambira stood quietly, taking in the sight of her former tormentors as they knelt before her, pleading for help. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze steady and calm. She could feel the weight of their regret, but she also knew that forgiveness wasn't something to be given lightly. Instead of reacting immediately, she took her time, carefully considering what to do. After a long pause, Jambira finally spoke. She told Ekwu and Ceci that they would not receive the help they had come to ask for, but they would have to earn it. She ordered them to work in her household just as they had made her do when she was in their home. They would clean, cook, and serve, just as they had forced her into servitude. However, Jambira wasn't cruel. She didn't make them suffer the way they had made her suffer. Instead, she showed them dignity, treating them with respect even as they worked. She made sure that they were fed properly, gave them a place to rest, and allowed them to speak when needed. Through her actions, she showed them the difference between the way they had treated her and the way she now chose to treat them. Her calm and thoughtful approach contrasted sharply with the harshness they had shown her. Jambira had risen above the bitterness, and by making them work with dignity instead of cruelty, she taught them a powerful lesson about compassion and the strength of grace. As the days passed, Ekwu and Ceci began to understand the gravity of their past actions. The weight of their cruelty slowly sank in, and the guilt became too much to bear. They had come to ask for Jambira's help, but instead they were working hard in her home, learning firsthand what it felt like to serve. Slowly their pride cracked, and they began to realize just how wrong they had been. One evening, after days of hard work, Ekwu and Ceci finally approached Jambira. They bowed their heads in genuine regret and begged for her forgiveness. The pain they had caused her was now clear to them, and they hoped, with all their hearts, that she would find it in herself to forgive them. Jambira listened quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of their apology. She had risen above their cruelty and achieved so much, but she knew the power of forgiveness. After a long pause, she told them that she forgave them. However, she made it clear that forgiveness did not erase the past, and she would never forget the way they had mistreated her. She allowed them to leave her home, but she also made it clear that they would never have the power to control her life again. They could go back to their lives, but they would never regain the position they once held over her. Jambira had found her strength, and she was no longer the woman they had once taken advantage of. Through this lesson, she showed them that while forgiveness was possible, it did not mean returning to the same old ways. True growth meant moving forward, not allowing the past to have power over her anymore. Jambira's story spread far and wide, and she quickly became a legend in Makala. People marveled at how she had risen from nothing, having been mistreated and abandoned, to becoming one of the most powerful and respected women in the region. Her name was known for her strength, resilience, and kindness. She had built an empire of her own, not just through wealth, but through the respect she had earned and the lives she had touched. Determined to help other women who had faced suffering like she had, Jambira used her success to create schools and trading centers. She made sure that every woman, no matter her background, had the chance to build a better life for herself. She provided opportunities for women to learn, grow, and succeed, just as she had done. Jambira believed that no woman should ever have to suffer the way she had, and she worked tirelessly to make sure that others wouldn't have to experience the same pain. In the midst of her success, Jambira also found love again. This time, it was different. She married a man who saw her for who she truly was, a woman of strength, intelligence, and grace. He respected her for everything she had overcome and admired the leader she had become. Together, they built a life filled with love and mutual respect, and Jambira's heart, once broken by betrayal, finally found peace and happiness. Through her journey, she proved that even after the greatest hardships, greatness and happiness could still be achieved. Years after her success, Jambira decides to visit Tumbaza one last time, the village where her life had once been filled with pain and betrayal. As she enters the village, she is struck by the sight of her former home, now in ruins. The grand house that once belonged to her husband's family, where she had suffered so much, is now a shadow of its former self. The walls are cracked, the garden overgrown, and the doors barely standing. As Jambira walks through the village, she hears whispers from the villagers. They speak in hushed tones, recalling the way she was mistreated by Ekwu and Sessi, and how fate had turned against them. The villagers have witnessed how karma had caught up with those who once caused her pain. They now see that the ones who had once looked down on her are the ones who have fallen into hardship, while Jambira, the woman they had underestimated, is the one who triumphed. Jambira smiles as she listens to their whispers. There is no anger or bitterness in her heart. She realizes that she has won, not through revenge, but through her own strength and success. Her heart is filled with peace, knowing that her journey was one of growth and resilience. The people who had wronged her are now left to face the consequences of their actions, while she has moved beyond the past, built a better future, and found happiness. In that moment, Jambira understands that true victory comes from rising above hatred and cruelty and letting success speak for itself.